Good evening, everyone.
Hello.
Good evening, Ken.
Howdy.
Good evening. We're coming at you from the frozen tundra of the Great White North in northern Ohio, where the wind chill's 40 below and you can feel it. Welcome to episode 460, I believe,
It's a good
of
run.
Line Upon Line. Daniel foresees the monsters and details that cannot be explained. I think that's the right one. So we would appreciate everyone joining us on this frigid, cold Sabbath evening. So if Dr. Ricks, if you would start us out, that would be.
We're here in the great honest state of Missouri. It's like a minus 20 some chill factor. So we're all suffering too. I think actually it was like a -3 last night. But we're going to do some divorce groaners. Groaners. When the friend marriage began to unravel, my 12-year-old son said, it's really largely psychological. And I said, what do you mean? He says, well, he's psycho and she's logical. Okay, another divorce joke. My ex-husband was difficult and prescient. Before our wedding, he declared in a piece of ingenious insight, he said, she said, Gene's insight, John, I don't know if I should marry you or if I should leave you. Something is not quite right. And John said, well, baby, you'll probably do both. Yeah, and she did both. She both married and then left him. Well, considering divorce, this lady says, I was feeling pretty blue. And she said, I just realized all my friends, everybody I know has gotten divorced. Is there anyone who's in a happy marriage? And her mother said, yes, your father.
Just him?
Yeah.
Just
I would have thrown this one in as just an old bonus. The guy says, to his friend, I gave my wife a ring. His friend said, she really wanted a car. She said that over and over again. So why did you give her a ring instead of a car? He said, well, you can't give a fake car. That's setting up a divorce. Anyway, I like that one, even though it's not quite so original as you might like. Today we're going to look at Daniel foresees the beast and the monster in details that cannot be explained except for divine revelation. And remember, many of the academic scholars do not believe there is a God. By the way, in spite of all the evidence that's totally debunked evolution, a ton of it really, everything that the original evolutionists said has proved wrong. But in spite of that, they won't give it up. They do not want to believe in deity. So therefore, anything in the Bible that looks too good, they've got to claim it's somehow a clever Jewish forgery. I mean, because otherwise they'd have to admit the obvious. So that's why Daniel is a problem. And Daniel has several visions. The first vision is in chapter 7. Now, these aren't visions of King Nebuchadnezzar. These are visions given directly to Daniel. And well, let's look at the first one. Can you read Daniel 7:1-3, Ken?
In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions. I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and four great beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other.
One thing to remember, this is in you might say, the latter 5 or 10 years of the Babylonian Empire, but Daniel is still there. Probably doesn't have the high position he did when the original king lived, but Belshazzar is his grandson to his daughter and son-in-law, but still, but he's still there. So even while Babylon is still the #1 kingdom, he foresees what's coming in the future. By the way, one reason Babylon can be called the head of gold was their false god, Marduk, was called the god of gold. And it is believed that in some quality sense, the Babylonian Empire had the highest quality. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, a lot of famous stuff that went on. Actually, there's even some evidence that they've proven they're messing with electric batteries in Babylon.
Oh, that's interesting. When you think about the raw and ancient world where, possibly gold and, precious minerals and things that are very useful are still just, lying about on the ground ready to be picked up. We've got, thousands and thousands of years of exploitation since then. Who knows what was available to them rather readily.
And people believe ancient people were stupid. That's not true. They may even have been healthier, many of them at least, healthier. And in some ways, because they didn't have tools like we have, like recording devices, they may have been healthier and had more disciplined minds than we do. I was like that for a shock. Most people have a hard time believing that. I would even argue, I'm stretching it based on things I've learned. If even you go back to the Civil War, which isn't that far back, many of those men did things in the Civil War that you would have hard pressed to get soldiers to do today. They would march 20 miles in a forced march carrying what was relatively heavy armors, guns with their backpack, and then fall into a death and life battle with another high quality army. That's not easy to do.
It's a long day.
I've done a 10-mile forced march as part of, I'm going to stuff. My point is, in other stuff, people may have been tougher in spite of the fact they had less medical and scientific knowledge than we do today.
And their mental capacity was even greater in many ways because, I've seen some of these, you look at some of these historical events around Britain and even in World War II, some of these, or I should say World War I, where in the Revolutionary War, where there were 12-year-olds that were in command of certain units, and I know you've probably seen these tests that were given to 8th graders, 50, 75 years ago in high school or in grade school, that even high schoolers and college graduates couldn't complete because the education level and expectancy was such a great deal higher. We mentioned last week, all you got to do is look at a photograph of the 1930s and 40s and compare it to a photograph of a crowd here today and see the difference in the muscle tone, physique, and the physical ability. Just our diet is really degraded over time.
Yeah, that's true.
When you bought a car in the 1950s or 60s, part of the instruction manual that came with it was how to adjust valves. Now it tells you don't drink the battery.
Because they don't want to get sued.
There's your comparison right there.
I've read that as well. And in absence of like the constant bombardment of information, and you don't have access to as much printed material and things like that, that the ability to memorize and retain things, it was just a skill that people needed more frequently. And so those intelligent individuals could develop a wealth of knowledge that was with them all the time.
So the fact that Babylon was the head of gold in some contextual sense does make sense. Mm-hmm. And the other ones, where more knowledge was available, they were stronger and bigger empires, but maybe the quality went down in some respects. By the way, I'm just going to read this next little section. I made a little chart. I'm just going to go through the chart. And those of you that can go to icgarea4.com, The article will be posted soon, if not already, and you can see the chart yourself. But the Medo-Persian Empire was slower than the winged lion of Babylon. By the way, they've unearthed a lot of old relics of the old city of Babylon. They see a lion with 4 little wings on its back. So that was one of the symbols of the kingdom. Anyway, the next empire, Medo-Persia, the bear, was slower than the Babylonian, not as mobile, but stronger. Like bear is like a pondering, powerful animal. The Medo-Persian Empire, slow and stronger. Then the Greek Empire was like a winged leopard. We haven't got to that verse yet, but we'll get to it. It moves very fast and like lightning speed. And then this is all off the chart, and we'll start discussing these things in a few minutes. And then the Roman Empire was not a beast. It was different. It was so powerful in a monstrous, ugly way that it couldn't even be compared to an animal. It was an iron monster that crushes all opposition. And have any of you seen, I think it was a Seventh-day Adventist. They used to come to our house every year or two, and they pass out brochures with their pictures of the 4 beasts. And they had one that looked a little bit like a triceratops, but it was made of iron. And on that little thing behind it was 7 little horns, but it looked like a mechanical monster. So have anybody ever seen any of those drawings?
I feel like I've seen that one. When you said Triceratops, that kind of rang a bell there.
Yeah, I've seen that.
I have seen that picture as well.
That's interesting that it's not any animal that he could recognize or anything like that, and yet clearly it's bestial.
Yeah, and then the end time Roman Empire, monster of iron, but it has feet of clay, and it has a blasphemous leader who says blasphemous things. And that brings us to the end time. And we'll, of course, cover all that. The next section, Daniel makes, he does make it clear that the kingdom of God will come and reign forever and ever. And that's mentioned several times in that section of Daniel 7 and 8. So in the end, we win. The good guys win in the end.
That's the good news.
Yeah. Would you read Daniel 7:13, please, Ken?
I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed.
All the others, they are destroyed. Most of them only lasted about a century or so, except for the Roman Empire, but it will be destroyed too. Only God's kingdom. So we're on the winning side. We just got to stay on the winning side.
He makes this statement here. I was watching in the night visions. If you look through this chapter here, you'll see that he says that 3 times. In the first occasion, he's describing the 3 previous the 3 kingdoms. And the second time he mentions in the night vision, he mentions the 4th kingdom. But the third time he mentions in the night visions, he sees this, messianic kingdom, as it were. And one of the things that I really like to point out in that verse there, he talks about, this messianic kingdom to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, which Jesus, always talked about, his kingdom would be established someday. But that it says that all peoples, nations, and languages. Well, right before our podcast began here, I looked up. There are 7,100 different languages on the earth right now. And nationalities, of course, is nations is nationalities. And we know that there are 195 different nations, I guess, or nationalities that could be, depending on the date that you look it up. But I looked up he mentions here peoples. And the only thing that you can't look up peoples on the internet or Wikipedia, but I thought races. To me, that would be a description of races because some nations have a variety of races or more than one. Boy, you want to find something very confusing, go look up races now and try to get a definition of it because it is such a sensitive matter anymore that they won't even distinguish between all the various races. And some people claim to be a part of a certain race, whether they're in one country or another. So, but either way, this Messiah, this return of Jesus Christ, the establishment of his kingdom will reign over all of these. And that is very encouraging and very good news.
The world will have unity. It'll be a forced unity, but it'll be good unity.
And it accomplishes what all of the other empires really failed to do. I mean, even Rome at its height doesn't really come close to, even though it controls the whole civilized world. In no way is it going to rule over every individual in the way that Christ's kingdom will.
One of the things that I read too was one of the commentaries stated that when you read these characteristics, there's sort of animalistic characteristics. In the beginning, when we went through Daniel first, chapters 1 and 2, it talks about stone, about gold and silver and brass. It's really giving sort of elementary description of these kingdoms, sort of an outward, external characteristics of these kingdoms. But when you begin to look here in Daniel's 7th chapter, he's sort of zeroing in on the real animal characteristics of these kingdoms. They become like animals. They are completely defiant to God. And the real man that has the spirit in him that looks up to God, that worships God, they don't have that. So they become like an animal kingdom. And I thought that was very interesting that he made that comparison between the two, that here, even at the very end, the only kingdom that can surpass this animalistic type rule is the kingdom of God. I got a cheerleader.
Exciting.
Yes, no doubt about it. God's kingdom will bring unity, love, no more wars, parasites. A whole lot of things will be gone. Everyone will be healthy. You just read, Isaiah's got several places it talks about lions will eat ox, straw like the ox. You don't have to worry about predators or parasites, or how if you go out in the woods, well, anybody goes in the woods is dog eat dog. By the way, you know an interesting stat my wife found, at least in an indirect sense, more people have died from parasites like flea bites than from a lot of predators. Because fleas especially carried bubonic plague, but they still carry a lot of disease even to this day. You never think about how dangerous parasites and viruses and stuff can be.
When you read about the Ebola outbreaks and Black Plague, a lot of those were attributed to rats and mice that carried fleas that carried the plague, and that's how they made it from shore to shore on ships and from nation to nation around the world. And it was an awful plague.
And God will put a stop to all that. But if you go out in the woods, it's dog eat dog out there. And little dogs, microscopic ones, as well as the big ones. And the only empire that will last forever, as we said, is the kingdom of God. But let's look at Daniel 7, 4, and 5 as Daniel talks more about his vision.
The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. And a man's heart was given to it. And suddenly another beast, a second like a bear. It was raised up on one side and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and they said thus to it, Arise, devour much flesh.
Maybe we can speculate a little bit on the gold image standing on 2 feet, but it's possible that Nebuchadnezzar learned a little humility because of his 7 years of that cow, thinking you're a cow, and he learned to be a little more godly and, under Daniel's encouragement and leadership. But then you get to the Medo-Persian Empire, like a bear raised on one side stronger than the other. They believe the 3 ribs represent 3 kingdoms that the Medo-Persians destroyed, and they were the Egyptian Empire, the Lydians, and the Neo-Babylonians. Those are all significant victories, and I think it's worth mentioning. And let's see. There's something else about that one that I should mention.
Something I read speculated that rib was used to denote strength, that absorbing those kingdoms strengthened the Medo-Persian Empire coming up, and to arise and devour more was they were given license to conquer a whole bunch of the world. Also reading about the "it was raised up on one side" sentence. I think it was the Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown seemed to think that was a slight mistranslation, that it could be better rendered that they like consolidated their dominion. It's the Medes and the Persians, they're getting together on one side, one was supporting the other, if you will, and that this is the only empire that coalesced the people together, whereas then Greece and Rome afterwards are both foretold as breaking up into parts, 4 parts and then 10 parts and all that, right? But Persia kind of pulled it in together. So like the raised up on one side imagery is having something to do about like the foreleg and the back leg, like ready to attack because they're stronger together. What words to that effect? Rough paraphrase.
Question.
That's a good point.
Could that have anything to do with the mad cow disease?
I doubt it. But one thing you could say is the Babylonian Empire Babylon was such a hard to take city. It took 2 kingdoms to combine to bring them down. And actually, it's quite a story how they got through the walls of Babylon. Anyway, I'm going to all that now, but that's very insightful, Michael. That it's the only one that had to merge 2 empires.
Got it from a book.
instead of breaking up like Rome divided, or the Holy Roman Empire divided to East and West, which I guess we all know, Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, East and West. And I actually think the East and West, they will get back together in some fashion or form behind the final beast, false prophet at the end. And next week I'm going to do some speculation about that, but it's pure speculation. But to me, that sounds logical, doesn't it? If the beast is so scary, that means it's got to be reunited.
It does use language about the whole world as if no one is excluded. So inside of that, I think that makes sense inside of that. We're talking about the whole world, then they have to coalesce to some extent.
Yeah. We might consider that God usually leaves China and Japan out of prophecy, kind of out on their own until the very final battle of Armageddon. But I do see Rome coming back together. Right now, it looks unlikely, but if you were there in 1989, someone told you the vast Soviet Empire is going to collapse in 7 weeks in the near future, you wouldn't have believed it, would you?
It happened so quickly. No. Yeah.
So the fact that could Europe be reunited and the Greek Orthodox and Roman Catholics and the East and West get behind one leader, the man's probably evil, but they won't know that.
Yeah.
Well, when you read those descriptions in Daniel, throughout the book of Daniel, even in chapters 7 and 8 and 11, and it talks about, he will have the power to change times and seasons and laws. He's going to have enormous power. And, it's, you really got to think about someone that has the ability to make those kind of decisions, who thinks, as we will see here in a moment, that he is actually like one of the Roman dictators or emperors, that he is God. That's beyond belief that someone could have that kind of authority and think that they could, change every law. And a lot of it, one of the statements that he makes in the book of Daniel is that he, or maybe it was Thessalonians, where he speaks out against the God of gods. He is in essence saying, I am the God. I'm above all the other gods. So what will he do? Will he demand authority over every religion of the earth? It seems to indicate that.
And I can see, we'll see when we get there how it was done, but I can see where he'll make even major Protestant denominations, even if they don't all join his church, they will give some level of allegiance to him. And we're thinking, oh, they would never do that. And we'll wait and see. I can even see the Islamic, I know they have two branches, saying, well, we're not giving up Islam, but we will give a certain amount of allegiance to this man and his authority because he's special. Whatever, however they word it. Something like that is going to happen, or to some level, and especially major Protestant churches accepting this man's leadership, and it'll shock the world, don't you think?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you consider that he's going to be a militarily powerful, in collusion with a mighty military power, and it also seems to indicate that he has the ability to control whoever buys and sells. So you're talking economy, the power over the economy. Some of these nations won't have a choice.
Yeah.
Because of their fear of the military might and the repercussions economically, whether that be economic sanctions against their country or oil or gas or whatever it might be that causes them to thrive, they will have no choice but to submit.
By the way, I heard a discussion of America, how America got to be the reserve currency of the world after World War II. We go into all the details, but it gives America a lot of economic clout politically. But now it appears that China, with some cooperation, surprisingly, from now Saudi Arabia, who was before with America when we first started all this, and Iran, and of course Russia, are now backing the Chinese. Maybe it's a basket of currency, but China's main one, to trade oil in the Chinese yuan and make it the world's reserve currency, replace the dollar. Now, that hasn't happened yet. But can you see that if our wild spending helps them do that, we undermine our own dollar a little bit. If that happens someday, can you see that could also partially explain why America is no longer the great power it is now?
Yeah.
It's all in process right now.
Yeah.
And they're working on doing all this as we speak. They've even written books about how they're going to pull it off.
Yeah.
You can buy them on Amazon. Seriously. You talked about the beast and how they could pull off the false prophet and have all these religions. Satan has been, impersonating God through paganism for centuries. If you go through the centuries, all of these beasts had pagan religions behind them, every single one of them. And that includes the fact that the Catholic Church adopted a pagan religion and just stuck Christ's name on it.
Repainted
this beast, when he comes through, he's going to, including Islam, that's just the moon religion, if you look into that, moon worship, and he's going to fit the bill of all the religions of the world. They're not going to have to force them. All these religions are going to say, oh, that's him. They're going to see what they want to see because it's all pagan based anyway. I think, in my opinion, that's what's going to make it real easy for them.
When Jesus encountered Satan, you remember what he said? He said, all this power will I give you. Will I give you the glory of them, for that is delivered unto me, and to whomsoever I give it. So he actually claimed to have power to give the authority over all the kingdoms of the earth to Jesus if he would just bow down and worship him. My question is, does he still have that kind of power and authority over kingdoms of the earth? You know, the Old Testament tells us that God only has the power to raise up kings, but is he able to deceive people into believing that he has that power and manipulating the minds of people to assert that kind of power and give it to evil dictators or people that would be subject to his will? But it's certainly, you know, terrifying to think behind the scenes that red dragon or whatever it's called in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation, where he, you know, it has 7 heads and 10 horns, is actually a description of Satan, the devil himself, as it's defined in the book of Revelation. It has that kind of power over kingdoms.
One thing that I think is that Satan wants to be like God. You'll see that in Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14, I believe. I think Satan wants to be worshiped, not just obeyed, but worshiped as if he's God. So if he is possessing the beast through that man, Satan wants to be worshiped. So there has to be a religious component to this empire. It's not just, I mean, it is political and economic power, of course, but it's not just that. It's religious deception as well. And at some point, here's how I want to look at it. I'm not saying God can block anything he wants to block, and he probably blocks things now and then, but he's going to let Satan do a lot of bad stuff. God could stop it, but it does appear, unless people have a great deal of repentance, which the Bible doesn't seem to indicate that, God's going to let the Satan pull off a great deception.
I feel like some of these last couple episodes dealing with the book of Daniel have addressed some of that, like the contest with the Prince of Persia that, you know, restrained Gabriel from coming to Daniel. I believe it was Gabriel in coming. That conflict, that spiritual conflict around the centers of power, it's probably ongoing.
Yeah, and at some point, the devil is not going to cooperate with what God wants. It's kind of, in a way, it's a little bit unnerving to think of that, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, especially if you read in Revelation, where there's almost unmistakable similarities between the book of Daniel and Revelation, the 13th chapter, and other chapters where it talks about, you know, he will make war with the saints and overcome them, and it will be given to him, will be given the kindred tongues and nations that we just talked about here in the book of Daniel, that he'll have worldwide domination and power. And I guess I asked the same question too. It sort of states there that it will be given to him to reign or to rule for 40 and 2 months. Mm-hmm. It's like a defined period of time he's going to be allowed to hold sway. And it's like, I guess the full ability of man to try to rule the world apart from God will be expressed once and for all. And then God steps in at the last moment and saves the people that are his.
And we do believe that much of the church, because we're proving ourselves now, will be in places of safety, and the new recruits will probably get most of the persecution. But I tell people the main thing is not to worry about how God's going to protect us. Our job is to be on his side.
Stay on the winning team.
Into the furnace.
Be on God's side. Let's go to Daniel 7:7.
Hey, but before we move along, could we go back to Daniel 7 verse 4 real quick? I feel like we skipped over the lion a little bit with the eagle's wings. I say that because when I first read this, getting ready for this, I thought of Nebuchadnezzar, right? And a man's heart was given to him, and obviously that's part of it. But what struck me was that, you know, he's in the first year. He's saying this 7 verse 1 in the first year of Belshazzar, right? So this is after Nebuchadnezzar. The whole thing with him being like an eagle and feathers and whatever all. That's in the past, right? I'm not mistaken in that, am I? So
I think
that's
it's
in
in
the
the
past.
past. Yes.
He's not prophesying about the past, right? He's prophesying about the future. And reading commentaries and things, man, you read some different stuff out there, and it's hard to know what to think and what's accurate and all that. I thought this was all about Nebuchadnezzar being restored, but on my own, honestly. But one was really interesting, and that about the wings being plucked, and the wings denoting, like you put in the chart, Babylon being mobile, like being fast. And then you get to the leopard, and they got 4 wings. Man, they're even faster, right? He's even more lightning quick, and he conquers, even more than Babylon ever tried to. It's interesting to think about what it put it in, like, while Nebuchadnezzar suddenly, boom, he's out of commission, he's crazy, he's out there in the yard, rooting around. What happens to Babylon during that time? Like their power, their momentum, if you will, is suddenly lost. Their leader is crazy out there, and that's something that they never regained. So therefore, like, their wings, their ability to go forward and conquer and spread was taken off at that point in time. And then I wondered, what was Nebuchadnezzar like after he was restored? Because his chapter, what he wrote that's in here is pretty astounding. And could you even go forward, acknowledging God and having gone through that and come to the point where he was, could you even go forward as like a essentially pagan world ruling empire? Like, how did he conduct himself after that? We don't really have a lot of insight into that. The last we hear from Nebuchadnezzar is that he's healed, he acknowledges God. It's like the end. Did he chill out? Was he a good guy after that?
Could, with Daniel on his shoulder, could be.
Right.
It certainly seems to indicate that he acknowledged God, and I like to think that was the happy ending to that story for that man's life, that God really put him through an unusual amount of trials and things to bring him to that point. He brought him down from, being the ruler over the known world of his day, and to hear those statements made about him there in the end, you often wonder is it possible that he acknowledge God for the rest of his life? I would like to think that was the case,
Right.
Another
And then
point
what effect would that have on Babylon?
Certainly.
Yeah, maybe they
Yeah,
behave themselves
they
better. That's possible.
Right.
Their aggressive wings were plucked.
They may have turned from the aggressive kingdom into one that was a little bit more docile, and that may have led to their downfall. It certainly did. Another point I wanted to make too was people that read, and the purpose of this podcast is to really identify these kingdoms in Daniel's chapters here of chapter 7. And we're talking about, Babylon, the Persian Empire, the Greco-Macedonian Empire, and Rome. And some might ask, well, how do you guys, or how can you speculate that that's the nations that he's talking about here? And I say, I've always used this, if you skip to Daniel, the 8th chapter, there's a couple of clues here. First, we know that Jeremiah referred to Babylon as the lion that came out of the north country and would eventually invade Israel, and God would use them to punish Israel for their sins. But also in the 8th chapter, I'm just going to quote this verse real quick. It says, the ram which you saw having 2 horns are the kings of Media and Persia. They're identified in the Word of God. The very next verse, he says, and the rough goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. So it has to be Alexander that's identified here within the pages of the Bible, and that is a remarkable statement, given the fact that Daniel wrote this so many centuries before, and it identifies the nations that at least 3 of the nations that with whom he is dealing with.
And think about it for a minute. You could say, well, when he was in the Babylonian Empire, he could vaguely guess that maybe the Medes and the Persians were off to the east and they're going to cause him some trouble. How could he predict that many years later, the Medes were the lead, but many years later, the Persians became the lead? That's mentioned in Daniel. How did Daniel know that? But even more so, how could he guess that a country way off to the west, Macedonia, would unite all the Greek Empire several centuries later and create this lightning fast, warrior, Alexander the Great, and conquer them. And then you go into, well, anyway, there's so many things that happen so many centuries later. You can say, well, he got lucky on this one, but there's no way he'd get lucky on all the stuff that's coming in chapters 8, 10, and 11, especially 11. There's just no way that much guessing could happen.
That's why the critics hate it. That's why the critics deny it, because it makes mention of these kingdoms or kings and kingdoms that would come, centuries later, and they say there's no way that he could have done it, because of the mention of these kingdoms.
He even mentions a fleet from the west, which turns out to be the Roman Empire's fleet, that forced the king of Syria to step down. Anyway, I won't go into all that story, but you're going to ask yourself, many centuries in advance, how in the world could Daniel have guessed that? Let's think about it.
Well, I hate to keep interrupting, but so many thoughts come into my mind. In the latter part of Daniel, it says that, he wanted understanding about what all this meant. He didn't really understand everything that he wrote or saw, but he did. The angel told him, "Go your way, Daniel. It's not given to you to understand these things. It's locked up for the time being, and it will be, unlocked at a later date." And so I guess he had to go away knowing that some of his writings he would never understand. He couldn't understand, but they were visions that were given to him, and he recorded them as he saw them.
Yeah, there's so much to say, I tell you. Let's go to Daniel 7:7, please, Ken. I think we haven't read that one yet, have we?
Nope. After this, I saw the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it. And it had 10 horns. I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words.
This fourth kingdom, the Roman Empire, lasted, and since the Treaty of Rome created the EU, you could say it's still in existence to this day, as Europe struggles to unite and create a greater united European empire. How that will go, we'll see. But the point is, and the Holy Roman Empire, you'll see throughout West. If you take a course in Western civilization, it was in the center of Europe many centuries, 1500s, 1600s, 17. Anyway, it's been there. Much different than all the other empires that lasted a century or two and were gone. And Roman legions were anciently known as weapons of mass destruction. If you read about the war with Carthage, when the Romans finally took Carthage, not only did they totally destroy the city, totally destroyed it, they plowed salt into the areas around the city so they couldn't grow crops anymore. And in some ways, some of the devastation, and it's now Tunisia, or the bad environment, is a result of the Roman legions.
Destroying the land completely.
You'll even see in the book of Acts how some of the leaders are so afraid of Rome. That's why they're afraid of Rome.
Well, look at what happened in World War II under Adolf Hitler. His torched earth policy. He was to destroy everything in his path. It's almost like the same characteristics are still there. He was trying to destroy factories and farmlands and whatever he could to destroy any chance of those people rising up against him again. And it was at the cost of millions of lives, and as well as, products and factories and things like that.
Yeah, he was evil. Let's go to Daniel 7:19, please, Ken.
Then I wished to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its nails of bronze, which devoured, broke in pieces, and trampled the residue with its feet. And the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn which came up before which 3 fell, namely that horn which had eyes and a mouth which spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than his fellows.
Tell you what, it's interesting to think of this for a second, but when you look at the history of the Roman Empire, one of the offices that Julius Caesar got on his climb to power, now this didn't give him the ultimate power, but he, through politics in Rome, he became the Pontifex Maximus. That is the chief pontiff. I think the papacy is designed after the chief pontiff of the Roman Empire. Now, admittedly, Caesar didn't get his full power until he got the best legions in the Roman Empire and came down and took it. So when they said, "Hail Caesar," they were worshiping Caesar. It was mainly because they're afraid of him. But still, being chief pontiff helped. And when people like Mussolini, and they would shoot out the arm, or Hitler, Heil Hitler, it was a modern version of Hail Caesar.
Czar is the same thing, which, until recently, pretty big deal.
Yeah, Tsar means Caesar. Even Kaiser means Caesar, just changed the language. By the way, do you know that, when Hitler mentioned the Third Reich, the First and Second Reich were German kings who were the power inside the Holy Roman Empire. And the highest honor in German military is the Iron Cross. That's not a coincidence. Do you see the connection?
Well, they had the Iron Chancellor as well. That was another.
Oh, that's right, the Iron
Chancellor. And I've heard one of the statements Mr. Armstrong made years ago was that they used the term Iron Fist. In their speeches, some of their speeches. I skipped ahead here in Daniel 11th chapter because I have noted in my Bible all the cases where this beast power sort of speaks, and Daniel records this. And each time it gets worse and worse. And the one in Daniel 11th chapter in verse 36, he says, "And the king shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods," which means God Almighty, "and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished for that is determined to be done. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any God, for he shall magnify himself above all." So there it is. I mean, that's like his personal autobiography of his character and who he thinks he is at that point in time.
It is kind of scary. Let's go to 2 Thessalonians 2, please, Ken. This just reinforces what Stan just said.
"Now, brethren, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God."
By the way, that falling away, I realize the worldwide church fell away, but I think it's more than that. I really believe much of the Western world, which is at least somewhat Christian and believes in the Bible knowledge will sink to such a low level that all these things can happen, and the people won't even realize, hey, that's in the Bible. That's in the book of Revelation. I think the world's going to be really, really deceived. And don't you sense the lack of Bible knowledge? I mean, Bible ignorance growing more and more?
Yeah, that's hilarious. 20 years ago, it was, some of the night show hosts would go out on the street and ask people, to recite the 10 Commandments. and they couldn't recite one. And that was 20, 25 years ago. I can't imagine what the illiteracy is about the Bible is now. I do, I make statements like that in sermons all the time. When you ask somebody about, the holy days or the Sabbath day or the days of unleavened bread, they have no idea what you're talking about. So to think that somebody has some sort of understanding about these deep subjects that we're talking about tonight, it's totally oblivious. I mean, they would be totally oblivious to the identity of these nations that we're talking about in this book and how they're going to affect the world in the future. When we read that these nations are going to be extant at the second coming of Christ, most people have no concept of that idea at all. Maybe
and as the knowledge of that stuff decreases, you can see the other ripples through society as well, as even like laws and things are falling away from that. Even if the people are not theologically, enlightened, if you will, society still would, that's the foundation of Western civilization, if you will, built upon, these principles of stealing and, lying and so on and so forth. But society is really falling away from that stuff real hard. I mean, adultery, lying, stealing, coveting, that doesn't really come in for much. Blasphemy, not worth mentioning for the most part. Idolatry. I mean, we had the pagan festival in Tyler here a couple month or two ago or something like that. I can't hardly imagine something like that happening 50, 100 years ago. You're going to have a pagan festival in the Tyler Square. It probably would have gotten set on fire.
Did they have the nerve to call it pagan festival?
It was pretty bad. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that's in the Bible Belt.
Right here. Yeah. Well, they brought a lot of folks from Dallas and outlying areas, but the whole town square was full of them.
Oh.
And they claimed that they were going to retake the town square that belonged to them. It was really amazing.
Yeah. It's a big
Things
shift.
are moving along.
Big societal shift.
Things are really moving along quite in the wrong direction, faster than you might imagine, right?
Yeah. One of the commentaries I read pointed out that the horn with the eyes like a man they related it to what the devil offered Eve. He told her, if she eats the fruit, you're not going to die, but your eyes are going to be open. You're going to have all this, this understanding, and you're going to know good from evil. You're going to be like God. And that's an interesting parallel, I think, to this little horn exalting itself and being, taking that up, being like God, trying to assume that same level in its own wisdom.
Well, it's interesting that, even, the Bible describes that in the book of Daniel, that in the end, people will travel to and fro and knowledge will be increased. I mean, you think about the ability of some people to grasp science and technology and math and medicine, the human body, whatever it might be. It's phenomenal that we can send. I watched this program where they sent this satellite, off around several planets in order for it to jettison out through the rings of Saturn in order to photograph the surface of Saturn. I mean, the ability to do that and to calculate all of the forces is really unbelievable to me. But they did it, and you saw the photographs to prove it. It's quite remarkable.
Yeah, that's
man
amazing.
has that ability and wisdom and knowledge that can be acquired over these decades. But it's done him no good if he doesn't recognize God as creator. Mr. Armstrong said something years ago that most of history will say that we're growing in knowledge and we're getting better and better and better, when in fact the Bible says that they started with gold and they're actually descending in their ability, because it's by the time of the second coming of Christ, we're down to iron in value in the world system. And I thought that was a really good analogy.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's interesting that the beast here. Where is this? Now I'm gonna find it. Oh, the beast here in the 7:19 through 20, right here, teeth of iron and nails of bronze, right? In which bronze is attributed to the previous empire. It's attributed to the Greek Empire. It's interesting that Rome, in a sense, absorbed Greece's culture and language and common usage, and adapted a lot of their mythology and so on and so forth. Kind of took it. That had never stood out to me before. It had claws, brass, tying it back.
Well, in the book of Revelation, he uses, when he describes that beast's power, he says that he has the body like a leopard, and he has the feet of the bear, and all of these characteristics are assimilated into this final beast. He really has, and the mouth of a lion, I think was the other one. Mm-hmm. He really has the best qualities of each one of these kingdoms assimilated in his own strength. And so he takes from each of these their best qualities and becomes a mighty power.
That's interesting.
And the final little thing I want to look at is Daniel's inspired details of the ram and the he-goat are also kind of remarkable. In the second vision, he details the two middle empires. Babylon's the first, Rome is the last. The middle two are quite important. So he mentions the Persian Empire and later the Greek, Macedonian Greek Empire. He mentions those two. Let's, if you read starting from verse 1, you'll get more context, but let's pick it up. Daniel 8:3, please, Ken.
Then I lifted up my eyes and looked, and behold, a ram with two horns stood before the canal, having two horns, and the two horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. That's
the Persian Empire. Later in decades, dominated the whole thing later. And that's important that Daniel could see that far in the future. And because the Persians dominated the Medo-Persian Empire, normally in most books it's just called the Persian Empire because they later dominated it. And by the way, Daniel switches language. The first chapter it's written in Hebrew, and all those middle chapters is Aramaic, except a little section of Chaldean quoted or written by Nebuchadnezzar. And then in chapter 8, he's now writing again just for the Jewish people after all those years of working with and writing for the people that he was working with. And according to a language expert, he says, using several languages as you go through the story actually proves he was writing it during the time he said he was writing it, because he was writing it for the audiences, which would have included the Chaldeans and other people. And then when he gets to chapter 8, he's now writing it again for the Hebrew people, so he goes back to Hebrew or their dialect to Hebrew. And they said if it were a counterfeit done 4 or 5 centuries later to try to explain some of the details, they would have all written it in Hebrew because it would have all been written for the Jews. And in other words, the language changes, and a language expert explained it better than I can. It's just one more authentication of the veracity of the book.
I think it makes it more real when you read it as it is in the book of Daniel, when he, and as I mentioned before, how he actually had a copy of the decree made by Nebuchadnezzar, and he records that in his writings for us. And it's almost like he had a copy of it there he was looking at as he wrote, or he either attached that to his document, but he recorded it word for word to what the decree was. And that to me makes it even more real and for the timing.
Let's go to Daniel 8:5, please, Ken. Our last scripture.
And and as I was watching, behold, a he-goat came from the west over the face of all the earth, and did not touch the ground. And the he-goat had an outstanding horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram that had 2 horns, and ran to him in fury of his power, And I saw him come close beside the ram, and he was moved with anger against him, and struck the ram and shattered his 2 horns. And there was no power in the ram to stand before him, but he threw him down to the ground and stamped on him, and none could deliver the ram out of his hand.
All Bible students recognize that lightning fast empire was Alexander the Great. He started as a young man when his father Philip, who built the army, died. He even took, I think, Aristotle.
Got murdered.
Whatever. Yeah, murdered. Yeah. By the way, there's a lot of palace intrigue in kingdoms in those days. Yeah, I get that. And he took over the army as a young man and fulfilled his father's vision of getting revenge for the Persian Empire's attacks on Greece. And literally, when it said he didn't touch the ground, he moved so fast in his conquest of what was the known world then that it was so much faster than anybody ever done it. It's almost as if he was flying. I mean, he wasn't, but in a sense. And if you look at some of his military feats, like they built a causeway island to defeat an island fortress of Cyprus. I mean, did I get the right? Cyprus. Oh, I got Cyprus. Anyway, and other things he did, just unbelievable military victories. And I'll just mention one final one. The final big battle, and the Persians have been defeated in smaller battles with him. He always won. He was known as Alexander the Invincible. But when they met him, they built a big army, had him outnumbered more than 2 to 1. And Alexander swung around the flank of the big Persian army, and with this white cape and white horse, looking spectacular, he led his cavalry straight at the king of Persia, scared the poor guy out. He turned and ran, and when his army saw the king run, they retreated. And anyway, it's a long story, but he didn't pursue. He protected his army and destroyed the Persian army. And I'll get to God. He could not stand against Alexander the Great. And you can see the prophecy really predicted that.
Mm-hmm. I've always associated that ability, of having this lightning speed with what Hitler did in his lightning wars of Blitzkrieg, because you almost see, as I said before, the same characteristics in his ability to mobilize an army and be inside of a country before they could even broadcast that there was an invasion. I mean, it was just simply, they avoided a lot of bloodshed, a lot of loss of life, just because they went for the heart of the country, the capital, and they went around like they went around the Maginot Line there in France, instead of fighting a war that had always been fought in that region and in a trench warfare. They took a different route, unexpected by the French, and they were in Paris, and that the rest is history. Same thing in Poland when they crossed over into Poland when they invaded Poland, and all the countries that they invaded were that way, just that lightning speed. And you wonder if that is exactly the same. What's the same thing that drove these ancient empires as well?
It might happen in the future, maybe.
And once you have that reputation, I believe I've read that a lot of city-states, big cities, walls or whatever, would surrender to Alexander. Just say, here, you're the king. Take tribute. Just don't leave us be and go on your way. Which that helped. Be a big scary guy. Just hey, you're the boss. Go on.
It's commanding a lot of power, like we said, like you said earlier, Dr. Rich. You command a lot of authority and power when you do that, if you do it without a battle.
And I think Alexander the Great believed that he was invincible. The story, and it's in a number of places, that when he came to Jerusalem, Jerusalem's a big, on a hill, big fortified city, high walls. They opened the door and priests came out. They said, no, we're not going to fight you. We're going to surrender. We don't want the city destroyed. And they told him, they looked in the book of Daniel, and that he was that lightning fast ruler from Greece, the significant horn. Alexander believed him. And I think He believed he was invincible.
He claimed to have had a vision, didn't he, of a priest that was clothed in linen, matching what the priests wore, telling him to go on to the east and conquer, something like that. Is that correct?
Yeah, we just talked about that. He actually had a dream while he was in Grecia, and he saw a vision in that dream of a man. And when he got there to the city of Jerusalem, that man came out, and they came out to greet him. And even his advisor said, "You can't go meet this guy." And he said, "That's the guy I saw in my dream." So it's really remarkable that he was able to have that vision, and they accepted him. And he had even allowed them to continue their sacrifices and their things that they were doing there in the synagogues there in Jerusalem. And if you want to read a little bit more into that, Josephus, the historian, even recorded that story in his writings. You can go back and look at that, read what he wrote about it.
I think this is true. And he's not I think Cyrus did this too. Didn't Alexander ask the priest to also pray for him? And they believed he was the guy, but he said, well, if this is the great temple of the true God, pray for me too. So I don't know if that part's true, but it could be true.
Most of them were that way to whatever religion they encountered. They wanted the blessings or the sacrifices to be made for them, to give them success in their battles. And I'm sure they did that. But that was really an extraordinary encounter there in Jerusalem.
Now, I know we're at the end of our time slot, and Alexander, I will tell you next week what happens to Alexander the Great's kingdom. But what happened is his kingdom sets up what I call the final battle of the end time. Like Daniel gives a lot more details, and then suddenly there's a time warp to the end of the age, or the end of Satan's age. And the details are meticulously accurate. That's what really bothers the critics. It's all laid out there. We'll get into some of that. And so next week will be the last of our Daniel series. It'll be, I call it the final battle, setting up the final battle. And I believe Daniel predicted it about I think his last writing would have been 535 BC and a couple decades before that. And you're thinking, wow, he knew all that way back then. And many of the stuff I believe will happen in our day. Daniel will be proven right again.
It'll be interesting to see when Daniel is resurrected, for him to read the full story of what he wrote and realize that everything that he wrote came to pass just exactly like God's word had recorded.
And I'll do some way out speculation of who could be the 10 kings. And I'll admit it's pure speculation, but there are some pretenders to thrones in Europe. Whether that means anything or not, I have no idea. Just have to wait and see.
All right.
Well, if that's all we have, unless you have something else to add.
Well, anybody want to mention anything in the news that seems significant? I just not sure.
Something that will go largely unnoticed. Japan is formulating their new budget or whatever, and they've increased their military spending. It's nothing overly significant proportionately. I think it's like 2% of GDP, but it is a big deal that Japan in the last few years, I think, has just quietly sort of blown past their post-World War II pacifist constitution. They've deployed troops there, because of China and because of North Korea and all that. They're remilitarizing right now, and they're having to borrow heavily. They have to borrow for like a third of their budget. It's a horribly indebted nation, I think the worst in the world, and yet they're convinced it's important enough to start pushing more and more into the military. Thought that was interesting. Not like big headline stuff today, but
yeah,
and they have nukes.
Oh.
And they
who doesn't? North Korea's got them. I mean,
and by the way,
been upping the ante in their military spending for the last couple of years. I mean, it's been something that's been very important to them, and it's been under the wire. I mean, it's not been widely reported, but they are gearing up. And we always thought that we'd be facing some of our former enemies again at the time of the end as a result of what we understand.
One thing is for sure, people say 2% GDP, but Japan is one of the biggest economies in the world. We don't really notice them that much because they're not discussed that much in American media. But that's a lot of money, 2% of Japan's budget. I understand it, whether they want to do it or not. If you were living, because Taiwan is in the same island chain as Japan, and you saw China's right now semi-blockading Taiwan, harassing them. If you saw the way China is acting, wouldn't you be afraid not to build up your military?
Yeah.
Right next door to you. Can you imagine them? Can you imagine sitting right next door to them? You know what that would feel like as a country. I mean, we have to put ourselves in their shoes and imagine if that was. Look what we did when Russia was trying to invade Cuba. I mean, look how nervous we became then. Can you imagine?
Yeah, and they've got North Korea, you know, launching missiles over them, pretty much, you know, over their territory.
Yeah, so I understand Japan, and Germany's doubled their military budget, and they have a big economy too.
Mm-hmm.
I think Germany I don't think they're doing it, my opinion, so much like they fear Russia all that much. But I think they feel the way the world's become more unstable, they think they need to do it. I think Russia is not the threat they used to be. They barely can handle Ukraine. They certainly are not the superpower that can invade all of Europe. Those days are gone. But they could harass neighbors like some of the Baltic states. Putin wants to bring back the Russian Empire, and he's gotten some parts of it back. You know, Crimea and Georgia and one of those, Uzbekistan, one of those states in Central Asia, I forget the name of it. He's gotten those back under his control. But it looks like Russia's not as big a threat as we would think, except in nukes. They got twice the nukes than everybody else has.
I was about to say, except nukes.
And
what happens if those fall into the wrong hands?
And Putin reminds people of that as if to say, okay, you all may have more of this and more of that than I have, but don't push me too hard. And I frankly think our politicians are being silly to take a border dispute. I'm not saying the Russians aren't bad guys, but take a border dispute, get too involved. It could lead to a hotter war, killing Americans. And if taken to the extreme, there could be a few nukes exchanged.
Wow.
And you don't know how much damage. Like if you dropped like 3 nukes on the East Coast or the West Coast of America, we would all suffer greatly. You have no idea how much it would mess things up.
You wonder who's running the show with Putin in his health conditions. If it's some hardliners that were, that had ties to the 60s and 70s, and when they were all about building more nukes than we do here in the United States, and whether they would not be afraid to use them or not is certainly terrifying to think about.
Now, I'm not sure about Putin's health and all that, but underestimating your enemy is a problem. This guy was on Tucker's show. He went to Russia. He claims that to varying degrees, 2/3 of the Russian people to varying degrees support Putin, some more than others. I thought, wow. The American media get the impression they're just about ready to run him out of the country and the whole country collapse. He says actually the ruble is higher than it's been in 8 years. Their economy is, for them, it's never been a great economy. It's in reasonable shape. They're getting plenty of countries will buy their oil in spite of our embargoes and sanctions. And Putin is not so unpopular. I granted their army is not as good and their weapons are much weaker than ours. But if you corner a rat, isn't he more dangerous?
Yeah. And the effect that it's having on Europe in the meantime, causing them to coalesce, causing them to pay more attention to their own militaries and being independent of the United States. They don't feel like they can rely on us anymore. I think that's very significant as well. That places like, Sweden and Norway and Finland up there talking about not being dependent on foreign supply chains. And, Europe's got to do it all for themselves to protect their values and so on and so forth. That's Europe outside of the United States is a big deal.
See, if it's really in America's best interest to have Europe dependent on us and not get involved in a third border war with Russia, and so they wouldn't have to feel. I just think the sanctions are actually hurting Europe more than they're hurting Russia. Mm-hmm. And it could hurt more this winter and next winter, depending on a lot of factors. But after our power was cut off this winter, we're having unbelievably cold weather for like 3 days. I'm not so sure this couldn't be the winter from. Never mind.
So someone posted today that you guys up north, your winter is down here in Texas. You need to come get it and take it back home with you.
That's true.
That was Kelly.
Kelly posted
Yeah, it was
I
down
like
in
that.
Virginia. Yeah, I said you keep it. We don't want it back.
Take it back home. We don't want it anymore.
We don't want it either.
Yeah, we don't want it either. Take it back up to Minnesota
Brutal, ain't it?
or Buffalo, New York.
Yeah.
All right. Well, with that being said, I'm gonna say good night, everyone. We had a good crowd. I'm glad everybody was in the chat room communicating back and forth. We'll. And you want to say, Michael, that there's no services tomorrow?
No live stream tomorrow out of Tyler. We put up an extra sermon today to compensate for that. There may be some other ones to pick up. I'm not sure. Yeah.
All right. Well, and nothing out of Detroit. And so the only thing live tomorrow will be the guys out of Atlanta on Facebook.
Maybe John Mitchell on the West Coast on Christian World Media.
Okay.
Maybe we'll find him there. They live stream every Sabbath as well. That's a little later. You can get up all nice and leisurely and, then tune in.
That, or you could always go to the ICG YouTube and grab something a little older or something from the ICG Area 4.
There you go.
So, all right. Good night, everyone. We'll see you all back again here next Sabbath. Stay warm and good night.
Good night.
Good night. God bless.
We're happy you could make it, and so glad you are here, and hope that we've been able to make God's word more clear. Until next time, may God be with you in everything you try. But for now, till next week, we have to say goodbye.